Grágás, the Icelandic law code compiled from custom, ties many such steps closely to consequences. The lawman was not only a voice. He was an office with regular pay in cloth and a share of fines. He had to prosecute intruders who disturbed the court. He could be replaced if people wished, a reminder that legitimacy ran through a public vote. That detail tells us something important about Viking order. Authority was a performance renewed on schedule, not a mask held forever. In some periods a lawman's election covered 3 summers, in others it was affirmed yearly, yet actual tenures ran for decades. The signal was stability through repetition. Rafn for about 20 years, Thorin for 20, Thorkel for 15, and Thorgeir for 17. Why structure a society around such careful step? Because the Thing, the General Assembly, was a court, a legislature, and a festival of memory all at once. To make that mixture work, the culture priced time, performance, and interruption, then repeated the pricing in public. The important point is not just that rules existed, but that people watched them enforced in front of neighbors. Consider the lawman's job. Before laws were fully written, he was expected to recite them, to be a living law book who could be consulted even at home. If he was not wise enough, Grágás says he should take counsel with 5 or more law-skilled men. That framework put expertise inside a circle, making knowledge a shared tool rather than a private weapon. The election of that voice was procedural theater. On the first Friday of the Althing, before cases were made public on the law hill, the Lögretta, the law court, chose the lawman. If consensus failed, they threw lots to decide which quarter would elect him, and the majority of that quarter could pick from anyone, even outside their own. This worked because decision power was bounded by timing and place. Norway offers a parallel architecture under royal hands. By the time of Håkon the Good, the kingdom was divided into 4 law districts: Frostathing, Gulathing, Eidsivathing, and Borgarthing. The Gulathing itself likely predated national unity under Harald Fairhair, suggesting that assemblies came first and codification followed. In practice, kings cooperated with things to make changes, because the law books said little about how to legislate. That gap is revealing. When the written code remains quiet about making new laws, the habit of lawmaking has to live in public ritual. Cooperation at the Thing turned backs and forth into binding custom. Where did compensation fit? At nearly every step. Fines priced interruptions, late arrivals, intrusions, and failures of duty. Payments supported officials, like 400 feet of vadmal, a wool cloth currency, paid each summer to the lawman from court property, alongside half of collected fines. Money and cloth ran in circles, keeping arguments in the realm of accounts rather than ambushes. This helps explain why Viking legal culture looks so procedural to us. If status came from performing the steps correctly, then every deadline, oath, and speech turn mattered as much as the merits. The important point is not that people abandoned force, but that they found force expensive compared to a well-aimed claim. Procedure offered a cheaper, safer weapon. There is a deeper twist. The more exact the rule, the more room there is to steer within it. If the lawman must be present on a specific Friday, a rival can plan petitions and ambushes of timing around that day, or rally votes to replace him if he falters. Deadlines and fines were meant to keep order, but they also created calendars of opportunity. Even the act of speaking was gated. The law hill centered the voice of the lawman, but cases were first announced through the Lögretta, and only then made public. That sequence mattered because a misstep could void a claim, or stall it for a year. In other words, the path to justice could be walked, or tripped, by paperwork without paper. From the outside, this can look like mere ceremony. But ceremony disciplined memory in a world where law lived in mouths. When Grágás describes the lawman as a living book, it captures a practical solution to the problem of storage. Collective repetition was the archive, and fines were the indexing system that made retrieval reliable. There was also a built-in humility. If the lawman was uncertain, he was told to seek advice from 5 or more law-skilled men. That is more than a safety valve. It is a picture of distributed expertise. In practice, it meant litigants could recruit opinions and marshal interpreters, a dynamic that made knowledge itself into a battleground. Add elections to that picture. When lots decided which quarter would choose the lawman, chance entered the field as a rule. That could break deadlock, but it also taught everyone to prepare slates and allies across quarters, knowing that anyone might hold the power this time. Procedure did not simply constrain politics. It scripted where effort would go. Norway's structure pushes the point from another angle. By naming 4 law districts, rulers acknowledged that law was local and procedural, not just royal command. Frostathing practice was not identical to Gulathing practice, yet the districts shared a logic of assembly, oath, and compensation. Codification did not erase variety. It stabilized it by putting borders around difference. Once you see law as a path through a timed landscape, loophole-like behavior ceases to be a moral anomaly and becomes an expected crap. The person who knows when to speak, which quarter will vote, how to trigger replacement, and how to price a misstep can steer outcomes without ever breaking the letter. The architecture rewards navigation. Importantly, this did not make the system cynical. It made it usable. In a world where kin groups could answer injury with injury, converting conflict into claims, fines, and scheduled assemblies was a brake on escalation. People came home from the thing with numbers to pay, allies to court, and dates to meet, rather than with wounds to avenge. That raises a question we will carry forward. If rules kept knives sheathed, how did they also tempt clever minds to the edges? One answer sits in the lawman's payment. He received half of all fines, a salary in vadmal, and the esteem of voice. Incentives that tied good order to clear prosecution. But incentives also nudge behavior toward chargeable terrain. Grágás goes further with a quiet requirement. Every intruder was fined 3 marks, and the lawman had to prosecute. That duty made interruptions costly for the offender and rewarding for the office. It also turned silence and deference into strategy. A party who could provoke an opponent into breaching decorum might shift the balance without touching the substance. This pattern, rules that keep order, and also map exploitable paths, repeats in Norway's scene. By fixing forums and naming districts, Håkon the Good's codification made it easier to know where to sue and when to gather. That clarity dampened surprise violence, and it also directed ambitious people toward studying the calendar and the variance between districts. Knowledge of difference became a portable advantage. Stability came from repetition, not rigidity. Rafn, Thorarinn, Thorkel, and Thorgeir held the office across a half-century, even as each year or term forced a renewal. The combination meant that people learned to expect tomorrow to look like today, but still trained themselves to meet each procedural moment. Then, familiarity bred compliance, and compliance bred specialists. Those specialists did not need law schools. They needed attention, allies, and memory. Who stood where, who spoke first, who counted the votes, and when a mistake allowed a fresh start, these were the skills that gave leverage. The result was a culture willing to accept loss if the steps were missed, and eager to press advantage if a window opened. What did ordinary people see in this? They saw their neighbors approach conflict like work. A wrong could be mourned and priced at once. A quarrel could pause for counsel with 5 law-skilled men. The path from anger to outcome crossed a schedule, and that schedule was public property. Responsibility shifted from passion to performance. There is a modern echo hiding here. Today, we talk about loopholes when someone wins by procedure rather than by spirit. On the Icelandic law hill, that habit was not a betrayal of the system. It was the system working as designed. It traded raw retaliation for a contest in timing, wording, and forum, and it made that contest visible. The remaining puzzle is how far that design could go before it needed repair. Iceland's answer, when deadlocks grew intolerable, was to build a fifth court, a countrywide appeals body meant to catch cases the lower benches tangled. That story arrives later, but its premise is already visible in the opening rules. Precision could patch gaps, and precision could open them. The law hill set the tempo. On the first Friday of the Great Assembly, the lawmen climbed up and recited the rules that governed the meeting itself. That opening mattered because it reset the clock, declared the procedures aloud, and told everyone exactly how the next days would work. It also signaled that timing and form were not decoration in this world, but the skeleton that held every case upright. His office was not ceremonial. He could lose it for injustice or carelessness, which tells us how much trust the system placed in precision. Before the law was written, people treated him as a living law book, and went to him for advice at home as well as at the assembly. That routine explains why Icelandic law leaned on memory and performance to keep order, and why procedures became the path to power. If he had doubts, he could consult 5 or more men wise in law, and their counsel was treated as sacred. That detail reveals a built-in check on one person's memory and a way to stabilize the spoken law without a written code. It also created a habit we still recognize. When rules turn technical, circles of expertise form, and advice begins to carry quasi-official weight in practice. At the close of the assembly, the same lawman announced the time reckoning for the coming year, a kind of public calendar. That was not a quaint ritual. It synchronized farms, travel, and deadlines for summons and payment, turning the year itself into a legal tool. The important point is that timekeeping in law were fused, so a missed day was as consequential as a broken oath. Local things handled routine disputes. Regional gatherings combined districts. And once a year the Althing pulled the island into one argument and one peace zone. Norway had its own great law things, like the Gulathing and the Frostathing, which shows the wider Scandinavian habit of solving law by assembly rather than offices behind walls. Who spoke inside these venues depended on rank and role, but the system was permeable by design. Chieftains and their supporters anchored the tents, yet any free person with a claim could enter the process if they followed the steps. That openness was both practical and performative. It invited participation, while making compliance with procedure the price of admission. A case began at home, before anyone saw the law hill or heard a recitation. Plaintiffs had to summon defendants with proper notice, using set words, and often in front of witnesses who later swore that the summons was valid. Those witnesses were not a formality. They were the hinge that let the oral system remember what happened outside the assembly field. The summons rules did 2 jobs at once. They protected people from surprise accusations, and they created a measurable trail the court could verify. In practice, that meant a case could live or die on whether the plaintiff had knocked on the right door at the right time and said the exact right words. It is here that navigation began to look like strategy. Once at the assembly, the first window for action opened quickly. Early on, parties had to declare that they would bring suits, so the courts could recognize and schedule the disputes. Njál's voice in saga captures the pressure. If cases went unresolved, men muttered about taking rights with point and edge, and he countered that there must be law in the land. That tension explains why the opening notice window was policed so closely. Failed to give notice in time, and the case could be dismissed before any facts were discussed. This helps explain why castcraft emerged in the margins of the calendar. If you arrived late, or delayed your opponent's arrival, the argument could vanish procedurally, even if the underlying grievance remained. The habit of winning by timing was not cynicism. It was survival within an exacting framework. Then came the work of building the case out loud. Plaintiffs stated their claims and set formulas that identified the wrong, the law invoked, and the remedies sought. The words mattered so much because they told judges which compartments of law to open and which penalties to consider. In an oral system, a formula was both a filing label and a promise of what would follow. Witnesses stood up to prove the earlier steps had been lawful. One group attested to the summons. Another might confirm where and when a notice was posted or spoken at the assembly. These were witnesses to procedure, not just to the underlying event, which is easy to miss from a modern perspective. The process had to be proven because the process itself was the guarantee of fairness. Oaths held the web together. Parties and witnesses swore using known formulas, sometimes on a sacred object, later on the Christian gospel after conversion. Oaths worked because they turned speech into a binding risk. A false oath endangered your honor and your standing, not just your case. That explains why oath strength was calibrated by occasion and object, and why oath-breaking was punished beyond the immediate dispute. Panels of men then heard the claim. In Iceland, the quarter courts grouped judges by region, while Norway's big law things also relied on sworn deciders, drawn from the districts. The composition mattered because it mixed local knowledge with a ritualized neutrality, at least in theory. In practice, parties maneuvered for a friendly bench, a habit that prefigures modern venue and jury strategies. Meanwhile, the settlement machine hummed along the edges. Safe conduct at the thing. It's peace. Let enemies share a field, camp in nearby booths, and talk through go-betweens. That protected zone mattered because it turned the assembly into both a court and a marketplace for peace. Between sessions, people bargained, offered partial payments, and tested whether silver could carry what swordplay threatened to break. Compensation had a grammar of its own. For killings, a man price, often called wergild, had recognized levels that reflected status and alliance. Injuries had tariffs calibrated to the body, time lost, and public insult. Those lists turned harm into numbers, not because blood could be counted, but because numbers anchored a path back to equilibrium. The system bet that people would trade feud for predictability. Arbitration, often by respected men, translated that grammar into a tailored award or a staged settlement. The key here is structured choice. The system offered ways to end a conflict early with a number, or to push forward to a verdict with greater risk. That design nudged people toward deals, which is efficient, but also taught them to price disputes with a sharp eye. Back inside the court, decorum mattered. People had to stand in prescribed places, address the bench in known order, and keep the peace upon pain of heavy fines. A breach of the thing's peace was treated as sacrilege, which put a buffer around speech. That cushion was not just moral theater. It was a functional shield that let adversaries speak hard truths without immediate retaliation. Timing rules at the assembly were exact. Certain days were set for opening claims, others for witness production, and some for closing arguments and judgments. Miss a slot, and the channel for your case narrowed or vanished entirely. That detail helps explain the later creation of the Fifth Court in Iceland, a structural fix for deadlocks that grew from the same devotion to channels and calendars. Appeals existed, but they were not casual do-overs. Moving a case from a local thing to a regional court, or up to the Althing, required fresh notice and clean procedure at each stage. The system wanted decisions to be steady, but not too sticky, a balance that preserved authority while admitting correction. Naturally, that layering created more steps to manage, and more steps to contest. That is where forum strategy came in. In Norway, regional laws varied in tone and tariff, and local customs colored how strictly rules were read. A skilled party looked for a district where their argument fit the legal culture, or where their support network could assemble. In Iceland, choice ran through the quarter courts and their judges. which made alliances at the assembly as valuable as a clever speech. Even location within the assembly grounds had consequences. Booths, those temporary dwellings along the lawfield, were not just shelters. They were hubs where factions mustered and mediators ferried offers. Being near a powerful chieftain's booth meant easy access to counsel and a show of support. What looks like camping logistics tells us how physical proximity translated into procedural advantage. At every step, there was a ritual of words. Saying the wrong formula could void a claim, and failing to include a necessary declaration could collapse months of preparation. That strictness served memory and uniformity, but it also created the possibility of ending a dispute by pointing to a syllable. The lesson was simple: learn the script or risk silence when it counts. Why did people tolerate that level of rigidity? Because it fenced violence. A world of farms and kin groups needed predictable ways to convert quarrels into outcomes that did not spiral. The law's hardness around timing and form created a stable frame where prices could be offered and accepted. In other words, rigidity in process bought flexibility in settlement. Safe conduct laws extended beyond the field. Travel to and from the assembly carried a protective aura, which discouraged ambushes of litigants on the road. But that rule existed to make attendance possible for all parties, not just the strong or well-escorted. It was an early recognition that access to the forum is a condition of justice, and it minimized a classic tactic: stopping a case by stopping a person. When a judgment finally came, it spoke the language of obligation. The court might award compensation, set deadlines for payment, or declare outlawry if the wrong was too grave or the offender too recalcitrant. Outlawry pushed a person outside the peace, a last resort signal that the system's remedies had been refused. It shows that compensation was the norm, and exclusion the boundary that protected it. Enforcement pulled the community back into view. Kinsmen and allies helped collect or guarantee payments, and default risk spread through networks. That arrangement made sense in a thin state environment, where reputation and reciprocity did the work of sheriffs. It also meant that people assessed not only legal strength, but also social capacity before choosing to sue or settle. All the while, the lawman's recitation threaded the system together. By repeating the thing regulations every year and completing the whole law over his term, he refreshed the shared script. His permission to consult wise men formalized a practice of collaborative interpretation in an oral age. That routine created stability, but it also rewarded those who listened closely and learned how to use each clause. The pressure to settle was not just cultural, it was structural. Deadlines, oath burdens, and the risk of voided procedure made trial routes narrow and costly. Offers of compensation could widen the path again, promising certainty instead of technical pitfalls. That is why booths became bargaining rooms, and why respected mediators carried such weight. They translated procedural risk into acceptable numbers. Of course, the same structure taught resistance. If you suspected a plaintiff had botched a summons, you let them walk into court and challenged it at the crucial moment. If a witness missed a deadline, you invoked the schedule and watched the claim evaporate. These were not dirty tricks in the eyes of the age. They were the lawful assertion of the system's values. Public recitation of time reckoning at the end of the assembly closed the loop. It told farmers when seasons turned, and told litigants when obligations matured. That annual reset prevented drift in a world without printed calendars, and it bound legal life to the cycle of work and worship. Timing, again, was the quiet sovereign. The presence of amusements and daily routines at the assembly reveals another mechanism. People did not come only to litigate. They traded, married, and made alliances. That thicker life turned the court into a social hub, where reputation could be made or repaired. It helps explain why decorum was so protective and why breach of peace carried sacred weight. As for jurymen and judges, the terms blurred. Panels were not anonymous. They were neighbors under oath, bound to hear formulas and match them to known rules. But their task was not to hunt for private truth, but to decide whether the public script had been followed and which tariff applied. That orientation makes sense of a world where law's legitimacy lived in shared performance. When cases jammed, the assembly did not abandon form. It built more of it. Chiefs gathered at the court of laws to discuss fixes, as Njal urged in the saga when men came home, unatoned. That moment reveals an institutional reflex to solve gridlock by opening a new channel, rather than ignoring the code. The same logic would later shape the Fifth Court. Norwegian lawthings show the same structural instincts with regional flavor. Their statutes guarded the thing's peace, set schedules, and listed fines with the same thoroughness found in Iceland. Yet local variations created pockets where certain strategies fit better than others. That diversity is not a flaw. It is what lets a federated world adapt while keeping a recognizable legal grammar. Put together, a case moved through the thing like a ship through marked channels. The buoys were summons rules, oath formulas, witness burdens, seating orders, and deadlines that carve safe water from shoal. That design minimized collision, but demanded navigation. It trained people to think in routes, to check the calendar, and to treat words like bearings. What mattered most for our larger question is how that training shaped behavior. If you know that a misstep can void an opponent's claim, you watch their feet instead of their story. If you sense that compensation is always an option, you price your brinkmanship and hold back something for a last-minute offer. The system taught caution in words and audacity in timing. There is a final piece to the life cycle that reveals the heart of the craft. Even after a verdict, there were often grace periods, staged payments, and opportunities to convert an order into a settlement with slightly altered terms. That flexibility kept people inside the legal tent, and it discouraged the dramatic turn to outlawry. It is the same logic modern systems use when they allow structured settlements instead of pushing every claim to final judgment. In short, the Viking Age case was not a straight line, but a managed corridor with exits, checkpoints, and tolls. Each element, recitation, safe conduct, oaths, witnesses, tariffs, existed to keep motion lawful and predictable. Yet each also offered a handle for the attentive hand. That is the quiet paradox we are tracing. Precision built peace, and precision bred strategy. We will see that when deadlock hardened, Iceland's answer was to add a court rather than soften a rule. That choice kept the map intact while carving a new passage through it. For now, the important point is simpler. By walking a case from summons to settlement, we can see how a culture learned to win by procedure without abandoning the hope of peace. The moment compensation was priced and deadlines were fixed, the law hill became a kind of board. Not a game in the playful sense, but a mapped field where each square had rules and costs. Wergild, the man price for a killing, turned rage into arithmetic. Once blood could be counted, people learned to calculate. Compensation existed to keep kin from spiraling into feud. By aligning payment with status and the injured family's claims, the law recognized honor without requiring revenge. That mattered because kinship was both shield and weapon. A tariffed payment said, "You have been wronged, but the community will not let that wrong consume us." This arithmetic had a second effect. It rewarded those who could shape a case to match a category with a known price. If you could nudge an incident from one legal box into another, the schedule of payments changed. In practice, classification became strategy. Families did not approach the thing, the assembly, as solitary actors. Kin and allies stood behind a claim, and their number and status changed the bargaining power. This helps explain why chiefs, the Grágás, were at the center. They organized followers, channeled suits, and knew where the tariffs and procedures intersected. When you lift conflict out of sudden violence and put it on a calendar, time itself becomes leverage. There were days for summonses, days for recitation, and days when the thing's peace forbade attack. The important point is not just order, but the creation of moments that could be used well or badly. Wergild worked because it scaled by rank and kin. A powerful family could claim a higher price and enforce it through reputation. But the same system taught litigants to ask, when is it wiser to settle, and when to force judgment? The numbers did not settle ethics. They settled accounts. Edge behavior grows where the borders of categories meet. If a wounding could be framed as less than maiming, the tariff fell. If a death could be argued as accidental under set conditions, the penalty changed. That detail reveals how moral debate rode on technical rails. Jurisdiction was not one thing, but many. Iceland used quarter courts, with 3/12 of judges in each quarter, a design meant to spread authority. Yet the larger the machinery, the more joints it had. Cases tangled. When they did, procedure itself became both key and obstacle. Njal's saga preserves a moment when strategy met repair. Njal stood and argued that the quarter courts had reached a deadlock. Suits became so entangled that they can neither be pleaded nor ended. The proposal was simple on the surface and radical in effect. A fifth court. The fifth court worked like a final forum, a place to bring suits the quarter courts could not settle. It gathered matters of contempt of the thing, false witness, false findings, and disputes where judges were split. What mattered here was what this repair taught people to do next. Creating a new court opened a new path. It gave losers a ladder, and gave planners a map with an extra step. In practice, forum choice became a tactic. Aim to win early if possible, but keep your case alive long enough to climb. Deadlock was now a route, not just a failure. To build the fifth court, the law had to expand priesthoods and draw more followers into the new thing. That tied jurisdiction to affiliation. If a man declared himself ready to join the new priest's thing, he entered a different orbit of authority. The forum was not just a place. It was a network. From the outside, this sounds like tidy institutional design. In use, it was leverage. Litigants could weigh which quarter's judges were friendlier, or whether a divided bench might be better than a hostile, unanimous one. A split meant a ticket to the fifth court. Sometimes a tie was a win. Procedure did not float above the facts. It channeled them. Every step required taking witness, a formal act of calling people to observe that you had done the step correctly. Njal's saga shows Mord in the fifth court, reciting the summons. In the same shape, the words were first spoken. That phrase tells us the standard, exact shape. Not roughly this meaning, but this wording, these witnesses in this order. Because judges could dismiss a case for a misstep, parties rehearsed form. Winning was not only about what happened. It was about whether you could prove that you had moved on the board correctly. Challenging jurors became an art. But if you could show bias or disqualify a man for kinship or prior statement, the bench shifted. Inquests of 9 neighbors might be empaneled to deliver a finding, and the right composition mattered. In that world, seating was not a courtesy. It was outcome. Splitting claims was another tactic. Instead of one sweeping accusation, parties could bring a constellation of smaller suits. Wounds to body, damage to property, trespass against thing peace. The point was both leverage and insurance. If one strand failed on procedure, another might survive. Safe conduct lines mattered because they created a geography of risk. On the way to the thing and at the thing, peace was enforced by severe penalties. But that boundary had edges in time and space. If a man could lure his foe just beyond the limit, the sanction changed. Edge play lived on edges. Settlement did not disappear when you had a strong case. Often, it intensified. A party with procedural momentum could offer terms that were cheaper than likely judgment, yet painful enough to feel like justice. This helped save face on both sides. It also let the winner bank certainty. Why would anyone settle if they believed the law was on their side? Because the law required careful walking. One error in summons or witness could break the chain. The arithmetic of risk favored sure money now over moral victory later. In other words, the structure paid realists. Kin groups understood this and played to their strengths. A wide web of relatives meant more potential witnesses, more influence on juror lists, and more negotiating power. This was not corruption as we think of it. It was a system that made family a formal part of proof in peace. The thing's peace was also a raw material for strategy. Start a suit at the assembly, and your opponent had to behave within the rules. That restraint bought time to gather support, swap districts if possible, or frame the narrative. The schedule protected process and created options. In Norway, regional Lathings like Gulathing and Frostathing also worked with tariffs and thing peace, though with their own variations. Different rules across districts meant different risks. That regional texture created a quiet incentive to bring matters where your reading of the law fit best. Forum choice was not simple shopping, but sequence mattered. You could begin with a claim in a quarter where your chief had weight, then route through cases where a split bench was likely, then rise to the Fifth Court on grounds of divided judgment. Each move depended on the last. Notice how this cultivated a new kind of status. Not the strongest spear, but the sharpest memory. The man who could recite the summons and its witness formula, in the same shape, had power. He stood in court and reconstructed each step, turning words into ropes that held the case together. That's why the Fifth Court scene in the saga reads like a ledger of verbs. Bidding neighbors to take their seats, offering the defendant a chance to challenge the inquest, taking witness to each sequential act. The case is a staircase, and each tread must be sound for the climb to hold. Edge play did not require lying. It required alignment. If you could shape the facts to fit a lawful path, you were not cheating. You were proving that peace could be made without knives. The culture rewarded visible skill at that translation. Honor became fluency in law, but this fluency had a darker efficiency. If a fatal fight could be framed as a feud response within the law's categories, the tariff applied and the settlement path opened. If the same fight was framed as contempt of the thing, the penalties were harsher, and the case rose to Fifth Court attention. The system taught parties to weigh that choice. Push for contempt when you needed to punish, process breaking. Accept composition when you wanted closure. What mattered was not only moral blame, but whether the public order would hold. People aimed at stability even while working the edges. Challenging a juror, for instance, was presented as guarding fairness. Yet the timing of the challenge could also purchase delay. Delay had value. It let kin arrive, messages travel, tempers cool, or the other side make a mistake. In practice, delay converted into bargaining leverage. Some tried to disarm a case by forcing it into a forum with strict technical demands. If the opponent was weaker on recitation or had fewer formal witnesses, the odds of a procedural failure rose. A clean factual claim could still die in the wrong hands, and that risk trained people to higher skill. Skill meant more than memory. It meant knowing which pieces of speech created legal shape. A summons had to name the injury, the place, and the demand. A witness had to affirm hearing those exact words. The chain was auditory law made visible, and any missing link could undo months of risk. This habit of legal speech spread into politics. Chiefs who could guide followers through the maze earned loyalty. Their booths at the thing became hubs. People came to them not only for protection, but for navigation. Leadership drifted toward those who could read the map most cleanly. Even violence could be framed within procedure. A blood suit might begin with a formal declaration at the scene, signaling intention to take the matter to law. That sign mattered because it staked a lawful path. Without it, later steps could be challenged for lack of foundation. We can see why deadlocks multiplied. The more parties learned to push at the edges, the more likely a case would stall or split. The fifth court was a release valve. It gathered misfit cases and contempt for process itself. Yet its existence advertised a new high ground to reach. And once a high ground exists, people strategize to stand there. A split decision in a quarter court, once a disappointment, became a gate. Lawyers, in the saga sense, did not invent the tie. They learned to live in it. That adaptation is the root of loophole-like thinking. Safe conduct rules had similar double edges. They protected assembly travel, but they also created narrow corridors in which a man was untouchable. If he could reach that corridor, he escaped immediate retaliation. If he could be made to step one pace outside it, he did not. Boundaries teach boundary play. Orchestrated settlements were another quiet art. Party might gather multiple small claims and bundle them into a comprehensive piece with a single payment. The total could be less than the sum of individual judgments, but more than the other side wanted to risk. Composition by package produced closure. This is where compensations arithmetic did its most cultural work. It taught cost-benefit thinking under honor's banner. You could insist on the full wergild, or accept a slightly lower sum now with public acknowledgement, saving your kin from travel, risk, and the possibility of later disgrace if the case collapsed. The contradiction is only apparent. People did not stop caring about right and wrong. They learned to express that care through the system they had built. Turning vengeance into fees did not erase feeling. It gave feeling a path that the community could survive. Even contempt of the thing, a grave offense that could rise to the fifth court, carried a message. Process itself had become sacred. Break it, and you threatened more than a single case. This helps explain why the law's harshest energies were aimed at false witness and false findings. False witness attacked the engine. If words could no longer be trusted to carry truth, the staircase broke. The fifth court claimed those cases because they were not about personal injury alone. They were about the thing's spine. In a system built on speech, lying was civil treason. At the same time, the very precision that protected truth could be used to box truth in. If a witness could be excluded on a technicality, his truth never entered the record. That tension is the heart of loophole behavior. The letter guards the house. It also leaves a side door ajar. Kin consent played into this. Many settlements required the agreement of multiple relatives. That rule existed to prevent a single hothead from dragging a family back into feud. But it also allowed strategic withholding. A relative could stall a peace to extract a better share or to serve another alliance. The presence of multiple courts and multiple chiefs meant overlapping allegiances. A man might be thingman to one chief, but have property under another's quarter. That overlap created choice points. A clever litigant used those points to steer into friendly waters, without appearing to flee judgment. As we follow these moves, notice the tone in the saga sources. The law is not portrayed as a farce. It is a craft. When Mord recites the steps in the same shape, the author admires the skill. The audience is asked to see mastery, not mere trickery. Still, edge tactics layered up. Juror challenges, form sequence, exact word recitations, safe conduct borders, package settlements, and kin bargaining. Each tactic answered a rule with a maneuver. Over time, the culture accumulated a toolkit. People learned not just to obey, but to operate. This operating culture had real virtues. It reduced bloodshed, centralized conflict, and made outcomes more predictable. Yet predictability draws professionals. Those who could repeat the performance well rose in status, and their style of thinking spread. Procedure was not a cage. It was a language. Once a society speaks in that language, modern ears hear a familiar sound. We hear appeals to higher fora, motions to dismiss on technical grounds, and negotiations that weigh certain payment now against uncertain victory later. The echo is not surface. It is structural. What mattered most for our question is the incentive map. By pricing wrongs and staging process, the law paid people to learn categories, timing, and speech. That learning produced edge play without requiring bad faith. The letter did not fight the spirit. The letter became the spirit's tool. And when the letter broke down, when courts tied or witnesses lied, the system raised the stakes by moving up to the fifth court. That move both protected order and encouraged climbing. Fix one gap, and the river of incentives finds a new path. We will chart one of those paths soon. For now, hold the picture of a law hill where men recite, witnesses nod, and jurors take seats by rule. Family stands at the edge of the booth, weighing honor against arithmetic. A chieftain signals which court to enter first. The case begins. The game is serious, and everyone knows the stakes. The result is not cynicism, it is competence. People grew fluent in a civil technology. They learned to win by the letter and claim the spirit with a straight face, because both flowed through the same channel. That detail will matter when we watch a fifth court case turn on a single phrase. We have the design, the incentives, and the edge play. The last piece we need before stepping into a concrete case is the walkthrough of how a suit moved, step by step, within this architecture. The staircase of taking witness will carry us there. In the next section, we will slow the action to the pace of procedure. We will watch a summons take shape, see a juror challenged, and hear a recitation climb from quarter to fifth court. In that pace, the logic of loopholes becomes visible, almost audible, in the words themselves. Sagas teach law in story form, and that is their quiet power. They were shaped for audiences who already knew the baseline rules, so the drama hangs on procedure. That is why the legal moments stand out, even when the fighting steals the headlines. We need a caveat, though, to read them well. Many sagas took written form in Iceland after the main Viking age, even if their roots reach earlier. That timing matters because it means we are seeing Icelandic legal culture reflecting on itself, not a neutral pan-Nordic record. Still, the stories preserve habits of thought that match the rural architecture we have been tracing. They show counsel rehearsing formulas, timing their moves to the assembly calendar, and pricing wrongs in a way the listeners understood. The narrative serves as a memory palace for procedure. Scholars point out that some materials genuinely go back to the 10th century, even if later scribes rearranged them. Saxo Grammaticus around the year 1200 knew many of these tales, and parts of Hervarar saga may preserve Viking Age verse. That matters because it anchors the legal thinking we see to a world of actual assemblies and fines. The surprise is what the episodes choose to explain. Again and again, a story lingers not only on a grievance, but on how a suit is built, where witnesses stand, and which clock is running. That detail tells us these were the levers people watched. Take a recurring moment in Jarl's saga. A man rises at the law rock to serve a summons, and he recites the charge in a measured cadence. It is not theater alone. He is performing a legal act whose shape must match the book of the law. Why did he sound so formal? Because the form of words protected the speaker from claims of coercion or confusion. A proper summons declared the forum, named the claim, counted the damages, and called specific men to bear witness to the act itself. Listeners in that world knew the stakes. If a single element was missing, an opponent could object that the case was not set in the same shape as the law required. The important point is that accuracy of structure, not just accuracy of facts, decided whether the wheels could turn. The sagas repeatedly name this structure. They have characters say they take witness to each step, a running ledger of proof. That narrative device lets us hear the staircase of procedure. What did taking witness solve? It locked contested moments to named eyes and ears while the thing's peace held. In a world without police, that practice made a timeline you could carry into court. Think about the steps packed into a single suit as sagas lay them out. First, someone declares an injury or a killing and measures its legal category. Then council decides whether to press it once or gather allies and arrange a more favorable forum. Timing is strategic because assemblies had fixed windows. The summer Lögretta set the main stage for public suits, while local moots could handle smaller matters earlier in the season. This helps explain why travel days and booth placement creep into the drama. Now the summons. No. The sagas are careful to note that a summons had to be spoken aloud with lawful witnesses present, and often at a place specified by custom. That rule existed to prevent ambushes in private, and to make the case public from the first breath. Then comes the naming of judges, or the chosen panel. Iceland's quarter courts drew their bench from regional priesthood networks, which is why Njal's fictional proposal points to 3 12s in each quarter. That arithmetic mattered because it determined the field of peremptory strikes. So, your challenges appear again and again in saga episodes. A party claims a judge is disqualified by kinship, interest, or neighborhood, and tries to have him struck. The mechanism policed bias in a small society where everyone knew everyone else. Why did sagas dwell on those challenges? Because a successful objection could collapse a bench, or split it into deadlock, reshaping the next move. That detail reveals how process itself became the battleground. When quarter courts deadlocked, the story takes a turn. Njal is made to say, "Our lawsuits have come into a deadlock," and he proposes a novel fix, a fifth court to hear suits that cannot be ended in the earlier courts. Saga or not, the point is institutional adaptation. In practice, that fifth court reduced the power of regional entanglements. It reorganized the stage so one quarter's alliances could not block justice forever. This is a design choice, and it has a telltale side effect. Create a higher forum that hears only cases snarled by procedure, and you reward those who can both create and navigate snarl. That is not a moral indictment, it is a structural prediction. The system raises procedural experts by design. Sagas capture that shift in human terms. Counsel urge a client to multiply suits, attaching minor trespasses and insults to a central killing, not to win on damages but to manipulate forum and schedule. The important point is not the insult itself, but where it places the parties on the calendar. Case stacking had a logic. By splitting claims across panels, you could force your opponent to disperse his best speakers and stretch his witness pool thin. That tactic made sense in a world where a missed word in one booth could be fatal. Technical objections gained value in that environment. If you could show that a witness stood too far from the summons, or that the recitation omitted a location clause, you could knock out a case even when the facts looked grim. The sagas preserve these logic puzzles because they were the living art of counsel. At the same time, the settlement arithmetic hums beneath the narrative. Wergild, the tariff on a life or injury, turns rage into a claim with a scale. Sagas routinely pause to count shares, signaling to the audience that peace had a price they could compute. Why was price spelling so central? Because compensation divided the problem into solvable parcels. Kin groups could each shoulder a fraction, and honor could be restored through a sequence of payments that matched the public measure of wrong. A good saga lawyer in these texts keeps 2 ledgers. One ledger counts law steps, summons, witness, panel, oath. The other counts silver, base tariff, aggravations and offsets for earlier payments. The halves meet when council announces terms at the booth. That is why audiences would remember lines like, "Let us set men at one again." The phrase frames settlement as a legal craft, not only as a moral plea. It also telegraphs the last resort when process is about to break down. What happens when the ledger fails? Then you see escalation into feud, which the sagas do not romanticize as simple revenge. They trace back the moment when procedure faltered and show how every later blow carries the weight of that missed step. The creation of the Fifth Court in Jarl's narrative is set precisely at such a procedural crisis. The quarter courts had become arenas for technical traps and split panels. The Fifth Court promised to hear what could not be pleaded or ended, a backstop against paralysis. We should ask how that backstop worked in practice, as the stories teach it. It did not erase rules. It changed the audience and clarified the script. Parties still had to show that their earlier steps held proper form, or the higher forum would throw the case back. In other words, the Fifth Court raised the standard. It did not lower it. That design helps explain the next behavior we see in stories, an effort to engineer a pathway to the Fifth Court while preserving the legitimacy of your own previous act. This was an art. Consider a teaching scene built from repeated patterns in the sagas. A killing occurs near a river border between regional jurisdictions. The victim's kin decide to serve a summer summons at the National Assembly to avoid a local squeeze. Their council begins by taking witness to the declaration of the claim at the corpse, which was a required first step in some suits. That ritual linked the later speech at the booth to the original injury, closing a gap your opponent might try to pry open. Next, the summons is served in view of at least 2 legal witnesses at a time when the thing's peace makes violence unlawful. This timing matters because it strips a bully of his favorite answer: drive the server off with threats. At the quarter court, the plaintiff names the charge and points to a specific clause in the law. He speaks in the same shape as earlier in the season, so that his steps align. The cadence helps the memory of everyone present, which doubles as a check against accusation inflation. The defense objects to 3 judges for kinship and bias, shrinking the bench. This is not obstructionism for its own sake. It is a safety valve that evolved because local networks were strong. If a bench cannot be trusted to weigh facts, the form must protect the fact-finding. A witness is challenged for being a neighbor too close to the disputed land, and that may sound arcane, but the rule exists to avoid conflicts of property interest disguised as public honor. The bench splits on the point, and the case cannot be properly ended. Now comes the move to the Fifth Court. The plaintiff argues the case should be heard there because the quarter court is deadlocked and the procedure cannot be brought to an end. The higher forum will not rehear the facts until it first decides whether the earlier shape held. Here is where a single phrase can decide the day, as saga moments underline. If the plaintiff's counsel used the older land trespass formula while declaring a killing claim, an opponent will argue that the suit was mismatched from birth. One word out of place, and the latter collapses. Why would that be so unforgiving? Because clarity protected the community from creeping uncertainty. In an oral legal culture, strict shape was the system's memory management. We can hear this emphasis in the sagas as almost obsessive notation of phrases, even when the events are heroic. The chronicler slows the action to reproduce the sound of a lawful step. That is a sign of teaching intent. It is worth pausing on the audience of these stories. They were people who gathered at assemblies, knew their local priest leaders, and watched disputes resolved in daylight with speech. For them, a legal scene in a saga felt like a Hotio video nested in the drama. Even travel scenes feed that purpose. A party delays their sailing because a witness must arrive before the 5th day of the thing to validate a summons. That scheduling explains why voyage lanes and fair winds show up in law-heavy episodes alongside oaths and speeches. The sagas also teach what not to do. False witness appears in Njal's account as a corrosive episode, because it hijacks the structure the whole society relies on. The fifth court is then cast as a way to protect the skeleton of process from that infection. What mattered here was not only punishing liars, it was choking off the incentive to break form by offering a better route to a clean decision. When a community can see a path to resolution without burning the rules, some will take it. Norwegian materials add a useful contrast. Their royal assemblies gradually centralized more power, and lawmen had more formal office. That difference shaped strategy, reducing the room for private bench engineering, but increasing the value of royal favor during appointment and review. Iceland, without a king, leaned even harder on shape and settlement. The sagas we have, written by Icelanders for Icelanders, mirror that emphasis. The result is a storytelling style that slows down for procedural beats and lingers on the arithmetic of peace. The drinking and sailing passages that readers often remember sit alongside this sober craft. Contemporary observers noted that these people were not the caricature of drunkards or simple barbarians. The same energy that took them to Greenland also built a legal world precise enough to train its players. Why does this literary habit matter for us? Because it shows how narrative can encode institutional knowledge. When a culture rehearses lawful phrases in its best-known stories, it is building a muscle memory for compliance and cleverness at the same time. We also learn how loophole-like behavior becomes normal without anyone hatching a conspiracy. If the path to safety runs through shape, people will optimize shape. The sagas let us watch that shift without stepping out of the story. This helps explain why technical objections are treated with respect on the page, not only scorn. Audiences could recognize a cheap ambush, but they also knew that form protected them when they were weak. The line between trick and guardrail is thin, and stories kept testing it. One more teaching pattern reappears. A senior counselor, often cast as wise and peace-loving, advises a hot-headed client to accept a settlement that looks lopsided. The reason given is not fear, but odds arithmetic. The fifth court might uphold a form error that will cost everything. That episode tells us the fifth court raised the expected value of careful counsel. It nudged parties toward settlement before the high forum could cut them down for mistakes. In practice, this reduced the proportion of fights that reached the breaking point. At the same time, the very existence of a decisive higher forum inspired new design games. Stories hint at parties who tried to orchestrate split benches on purpose to get in front of the fifth court where their opponent's earlier sloppiness would finally count. That is the double edge of reform. So what do we take from these narrative textbooks? They bind moments of grief to a sequence of choices and phrases, then track the consequences of each fork. Their authors knew that listeners would carry those ladders into their own disputes. We are not forced to choose between literature and legal history here. Here, the sagas are not court transcripts, but their procedural spine lines up with what we know from law codes and assembly practice. That alignment is why they are so useful for understanding behavior. Watch for the formulas, the time words, the seating details, and the counting of shares. Those are not throwaway props. They are the grammar of order. When a saga slows down for them, it is not stalling the plot. It is teaching the craft beneath it. In the next stretch, we will follow one of these procedural staircases with finer granularity. Each rung has a purpose, and each purpose can be inverted. Somewhere on that climb, a single phrase will do the work of a verdict. Stand for a moment on the law hill and listen to how a case lives by its wording. The precise phrases, the timed steps, the public witnesses, these were not theatrics. They were the operating system. What mattered here was that once a society solves violence by procedure, people learn to win by the rules themselves. Today, we would call many of those wins loopholes. But the logic is older than our vocabulary. Start with compensation. In Iceland, wergild, literally man price, turned outrage into arithmetic. That was not moral indifference. It was governance by exchange. By pricing wrongs, the law created a pathway from feud to settlement, and it made peace a purchasable outcome. This helps explain why the best litigators in the sagas are also deft negotiators. If the endpoint is silver, the route becomes a bargaining landscape shaped by deadlines, kinship support, and the risk of outlawry. Modern settlement works the same way in different clothes. A company that pays to close a lawsuit is not agreeing it was wrong. It is converting uncertainty into a cost it can manage. That detail reveals why Icelandic form mattered so much. The stronger your control of procedure, the better your position when the talk turns to silver. In other words, form fluency priced into the deal. It still does, whether the currency is reputation, court time, or cash. Now consider oaths. In the Viking world, oaths were not just promises. They were compliance attestations with teeth. An oath could open a claim, seal a settlement, or define the range of permissible testimony. The point was to bind words to consequences. When Jarl's saga describes a party punished for contempt of the thing after bringing unlawful witness, it is tracking the same logic modern regulators use when they attach penalties to false certifications. You raise the cost of lying so the system can trust attestations at scale. That, in turn, connects to witness rules as evidentiary gates. You did not simply speak. You placed your words inside a frame the court could recognize. The saga formula, in the same shape, is a reminder that the legal value of speech depended on exact replication. That detail mattered because it created a filter. If your bearing of witness deviated from the authorized shape, the other side could exclude it without touching the underlying facts. In practice, many modern exclusion doctrines do the same thing. Venue choice reveals another echo. Quarter courts drew judges from local districts, and parties built strategies around who those people would be and where their neighbors sat. That is not so different from corporate forum selection, where a contract or a filing chooses the court that will hear the case. From the outside, venue looks like a dull logistical step. In practice, it can decide the whole outcome. Pick the forum that favors your reading of procedure, and you are already halfway to winning. Timing, too, became leverage. The thing's calendar turned days into legal resources. If you forced a hearing to slip past a lawful window, or you exploited safe conduct periods to manage appearances, you converted time into advantage. That principle lives today in every extension motion, every statute of limitations defense, and every tax deferral strategy. The important point is not just that delay exists, but that the rules quietly reward those who can make time align with their interests. Here the Vikings' commercial instincts mattered. The very fact that the word wergild in modern Russian means a peddler hints at a culture comfortable with pricing, timing, and exchange. Merchants think in margins and windows. Law that pays peace and silver will educate its public to think like traders, even in court. This helps explain why procedural mastery spread beyond specialists. It was not a private vice. It was a public skill linked to everyday economic habits. Jurisdictional layering then amplified those instincts. Iceland's Fifth Court was invented to resolve deadlocks, but it also created a new pathway, a higher venue with stricter form. That move resembles the way an appeal adds a second stage today, where technical error can overturn a result without relitigating facts. Once a new layer exists, parties learn to play toward it. If a split bench in a lower court unlocks Fifth Court review, you do not just argue to win. You sometimes argue to tie. Technical invalidation became a tool in its own right. The summons had to be performed with particular words, to the right ears, at the right place. The saga is scene where a litigant recite, "I summon this cause before the fifth court. I summon with a lawful summons," is not colorful redundancy. It is checklist compliance. Miss a piece, and your case collapses on the spot. Modern practice keeps that lineage alive when a lawsuit fails for improper service, or a filing is dismissed because the complaint's elements were not pled correctly. Record-making turned language into enforceable memory. Taking witness was not mere ceremony, it was the original public ledger. You gathered neighbors, spoke the formula, and secured the recognition that the step had occurred. That detail tells us why the system could afford to be distributed and seasonal. Procedure created a portable archive. Today's equivalents are notarization, proof of service, and registered filings. Mundane steps that carry force because the community, or the state, agrees to treat them as reliable anchors in time. Packaging settlements shows another structural rhyme. In the sagas, parties often fold multiple claims, kin obligations, and travel costs into a single peace payment. That is not different in principle from modern global settlements that include damages, attorney's fees, and future waivers. The important point is the incentive shape. If one transaction can clear a thicket of exposure, the system rewards those who can count, combine, and close. You do not just fight, you design exits. When we contrast Iceland with Norway's more centralized order, the parallels shift but do not break. Royal power in Norway offered litigants a different kind of venue, one where authority could override local entanglements. That created its own tactical moves, seeking the king's jurisdiction when local procedure looked hostile, or accepting fines calibrated by royal law rather than negotiated with neighbors. The mechanism is familiar. When layers of authority coexist, choice of path becomes a strategy. Classification games sat near the core. In Iceland, the category you placed an act into, lesser outlawry versus full outlawry, personal injury versus property, set the penalties and the options for settlement. In modern law, reclassification lives everywhere. A company treats a worker as a contractor to change the rulebook. A transaction is framed as a loan instead of a sale to change taxes. The behaviors rhyme because the reward structure is similar. If the category drives the consequence, argument will orbit the category. All of this made nonviolent failure states essential. Outlawry was harsh, but before you reached it, the law offered gradients, lesser outlawry, fines, and safe conduct terms that allowed most disputes to stop short of ruin. That design is echoed in modern consent decrees and deferred prosecutions, where institutions accept structured penalties to avoid existential judgments. The system's aim is continuity with correction. The user's response is optimization within the lanes provided. Even in oaths and witnesses, when seen as compliance infrastructure, trained a modern habit: certify first, audit later. A sworn statement allowed the system to move, and only when challenged did formal scrutiny engage. That is much like tax returns accepted as filed until reviewed, or corporate disclosures cleared pending examination. The benefit is speed. The cost is that the first gate can be gained by those who master its format. In the same shape, once a saga phrase is now a compliance reflex. What mattered underneath the silver and the sentences was a cultural settlement, peace by procedure. When a community prizes orderly closure, it teaches its members to navigate edges without shame. Edgework becomes civic competence, not deviance. That is why the sagas admire the lawyerly mind, even when it frustrates opponents. And it is why modern audiences recognize the moves. The terrain changed. The habit did not. We are about to put this logic back on the law hill and run a single case, step by step, from summons to the fifth court. Watch as one phrase aligns each rung of the ladder. Watch, as timing and venue do quiet work that the facts alone could not do. The staircase is narrow, and the footing is legal speech. Miss one word, and the climb ends where it began. Take a breath. The next beat is the walkthrough. Before we climb the step-by-step staircase of a single lawsuit, we need to look at how the stairs were built. The architecture of Viking Age law did not appear fully formed. It accumulated. This matters because accumulation produces seams, and seams are where careful players learn to place their weight. Start with Iceland's timer. In Grágás, the Icelandic law book, a brief line stands out. The lawman pays a fine of 3 marks if he does not reach the Althing on the Friday before people go to the law hill, unless necessity stops him. The people may then elect another lawman if they wish. That one clause shows 3 design choices. It sets a deadline, it sets a price for missing it, and it gives the crowd the power to replace the official. Deadlines make public order predictable. If everyone knows when the lawman must be present, everyone can plan filings, summons recitations, and witness gatherings around that anchor. Fines create an incentive for punctuality that does not depend on moral appeal. And elective replacement gives the community a pressure valve. Together, these tools explain why procedure in Iceland felt reliable enough to invest in. Litigants could build strategies on known calendars rather than on guesswork. Yet that same predictability trained people to think in rules. If Friday was the cutoff, then a filing on Thursday counted as timely, no matter how disruptive it might be in spirit. If necessity excused an absence, then the next tactical question became, what qualifies as necessity? Vague mercy terms are humane, but they also invite parsing. That is the seed of loophole behavior, players working to fit facts into the permitted exception. The annual election of Iceland's lawman amplified this dynamic. On paper, the office turned over every year. In practice, the same figures often held office for long stretches. Rafn for about 20 years, then Thorarin for another 20, Thorkel for 15, and Thorgeir for 17. Voters could renew or replace at each Althing. The result was unusual, accountability with stability. The system imposed a regular check, but the community often chose continuity. That duality mattered. Continuity allowed an interpretive tradition to settle. People learned how a given lawman handled edge cases and could anticipate outcomes. Accountability, meanwhile, kept those interpretations inside a broad consensus, because a lawman far out of step could be replaced. This mix is classic path dependence. Once a certain reading of a rule became standard, each subsequent year made it harder to dislodge. Strategic actors flourished in that stable channel. Norway's path to stability followed a different route, but created a similar space for procedural expertise. Under King Håkon the Good, Norway was organized into 4 law districts: Frostathing, Gulathing, Eidsivathing, and Borgarthing. Each district had its own law code, refined within a regional assembly. The Gulathing likely predated national consolidation and had existed long before the rule of Harald Fairhair. That detail tells us something important. A king did not invent the legal culture. He standardized what local assemblies were already doing. Codification was a recognition strategy. It wrote down, and thereby stabilized, regional routines that had been carried in memory and practice. Writing increases predictability because it fixes text, but it also increases the power of interpretation. A written clause invites Lingdebline argument. When differences between districts were acknowledged as legitimate, procedural competence became partly local knowledge. Advocates needed to know which formulas and steps were binding in Frostathing, compared to Gulathing. Inside those Norwegian assemblies, we can see how rule rituals policed the space of judgment. Frostathing's law requires that, in Outer Trøndelag, 60 men from each fylke, each district, be named into the law court. The oldest and most able were to be selected. Crucially, lendermen, the king's landed followers, could not enter the law court unless the farmers allowed it. And there was a boundary, the holy rope, the webend. A man not named who sat inside the rope owed a mark. A man who left the court and crossed the rope to another place owed a full mark. These details served multiple functions. The rope marked jurisdiction, turning a social gathering into a legal arena where different rules applied. Entry rules protected the court from political intimidation by royal magnates, reinforcing that law belonged to the community. Fines enforced not just outcomes but posture. Who could sit, where one could move, and when? In practice, posture rules became procedural tools. If someone standing could be challenged by pointing to where they sat, then physical positioning had legal meaning. That drove careful choreography. When we look at how laws changed in Norway, the same cooperative logic appears. The codes themselves do not spell out a single fixed procedure for adding new laws. Instead, what seems evident is that changes came through cooperation between king and people. Adoption depended on the proposer's standing, their reputation for wisdom, and their influence. That reveals a political filter rather than a purely mechanical one. An idea moved not only because it solved a problem, but because it came from a figure the assemblies trusted. This political filter does two things to a legal system. It slows change, because each proposal must pass through reputational gates. And it produces patch lawmaking, where additions are bolted onto existing structures instead of replacing them wholesale. Patch lawmaking preserves stability, but also layers complexity. Each fix is tethered to the language, habits, and compromises already in place. Over time, that layering produces both coherence and seams, points where old phrases and new intentions do not line up. You can see the tension in the early Norwegian monarchy. Harald Fairhair, after unifying Norway, seems to have imagined royal power standing above law, with changes issuing from the crown. Håkon the Good pulled in the other direction, yielding proprietary rights over law back to the country. That settlement, sometimes described as the landsret, the law of the land, created a new relationship between king and people. The king was not the law itself. He was a participant in a legal order that required consent. Consent-based law is robust, but it is negotiated. Negotiated orders rely on words that different factions can accept. Those words are often precise in places and soft in others, because precision buys compliance and softness buys agreement. The soft spots, terms like necessity, reasonableness, good standing, act like hinges that keep the system flexible. They also supply room for argument. That is not a flaw. It is a feature that makes rule systems durable. But it is exactly where tactical thinking thrives. Iceland, without a king, leaned even harder on this negotiated precision. The lawman's job included reciting the law at the Althing, 1/3 of it each summer, keeping the code present in communal memory. Over time, that living recitation was compiled into what we call Grágás. Writing did not eliminate orality. It sat alongside it, reinforcing shared formulas. In practice, it sharpened the focus on wording. If the community remembers a clause exactly, then exactness becomes the test. Add to this the habit of incremental fixes. When the quarter courts deadlocked too often, Iceland added a 5th court. The new layer solved a deadlock. But it did not simplify the code. It added entrances, added witness rules, and added grounds for objection. Each rung on the staircase had to align with the one above it. That requirement meant more opportunities to argue that an early step was faulty and should invalidate the climb. The very act of stabilizing the system enlarged the field for procedural play. We can return to the lawman's Friday rule to see how an adgan creates new edges. The clause includes a mercy, no necessity hindering, that feels humane. but it also raises an interpretive ledger. What counts? Illness might, flooded rivers might, travel blocked by a feud might. Each case invites testimony and counter-testimony about conditions, which becomes a mini-trial about attendance before the real trial begins. The fix to ensure punctuality produces a forum for arguing punctuality. The same is true for Frostathing's rope rules. Prohibiting unnamed men from sitting inside the rope keeps the court orderly, but it also creates a technical trap. If a representative's naming was flawed, wrong formula, wrong district citation, then an opponent might challenge their presence inside the rope and trigger a fine or expulsion. That challenge can stall proceedings or discredit a side before arguments begin. Order here is enforced by ritual, and ritual supplies handles for leverage. Stability is the quiet enabler of these techniques. When lawmen serve for years, when assemblies meet on steady calendars, when districts keep their own codes for generations, specialists emerge. Those specialists remember not just the law, but the interlocks, how a summons on one day interacts with a witness oath on the next, which in turn interacts with eligibility to sit under the rope. Predictability encourages planning, and planning pushes attention toward edges. By the 10th century, Northern codes were famous for their comprehensiveness and clarity relative to other European laws of the time. That comprehensiveness was not abstract. It grew from the need to govern real assemblies of farmers, ship captains, and traders. The codes explain who speaks first, who can be seated, how to count compensation, and how to escalate a dispute when earlier steps fail. This operational detail tells us why loophole-like behavior appears early. The more operational a code becomes, the more consequences hinge on sequence and wording. There is an important corrective here. Loophole often implies cynicism. What we are seeing in Viking Age law looks more like system literacy. If order depends on negotiated public steps, then citizens will attend to those steps. Over time, that attention hardens into expertise. Experts then test the boundaries because boundaries decide outcomes. The behavior can feel sharp, but it is a rational response to the incentives the system sets. Norway's district diversity adds another layer to this literacy. A man from the Gulathing district traveling north into the Frostathing realm could not assume that the same phrases unlocked the same doors. Local elders guarded local formulas. That demanded deference to regional procedure and created an economy of guidance. People who knew the how of a place became essential, and whenever essential knowledge concentrates, gatekeeping follows. Gatekeeping in law does not just keep people out. It trains those who enter to prize form. The connection to our promised staircase is now in view. Each stair was built by choices like these: elected lawmen with punctuality rules, assemblies with sacred boundaries, districts with their own codes, and a culture that added fixes as problems appeared. The effect is a stable, legible, and increasingly intricate set of paths. Intricate does not mean brittle. It means precise. And precision, once learned, turns into power. In the next climb, one clause will do more work than it seems to on the page. A word about timing will shift a witness from valid to void. A naming formula will either open the rope or close it. These are not tricks. They are the consequences of codified change operating in public. And they show how, 1,000 years ago, people learned to win not by shouting louder, but by reading closer. We end back on the law hill, because the architecture of that space is the lesson. A claim lived or died by phrases, by witnesses in the right place, and by a clock everyone recognized. That design did not only forbid, it channeled, priced, and scheduled behavior. What mattered here was how clarity trained a population to think in procedures. Consider the chain we watched crystallize in the Fifth Court. Mordvalgard's son moved step by step, taking witness, repeating his summons, and insisting that the words be in the same shape at every rung. That detail reveals a design choice. The system did not just ask what happened, it asked whether each certification matched its ancestor. In practice, matching language became a navigational instrument. When he was told there was more yet to do, something about 4/12s, we glimpsed the depth of those instruments. The bench, its divisions, and the right to object were not scenery, they were levers. Each lever existed to keep judgment legitimate by form. This helps explain why the Fifth Court solved deadlock, and, at the same time, opened a new field for edge play. The compensation culture behind all this made order possible. A world of wergild, of scheduled fines, and of negotiated settlements turned private vengeance into priced accountability. Pricing harm stabilized conflict because it gave families a lawful exit from spirals of retaliation. The important point is not just that payments calmed feuds, but that prices taught people to see harm in categories. Categories helped, and they also tempted. Fixed thresholds create cliffs, and cliffs invite careful steps. If the fine doubled above a certain condition, then claims and defenses would strain to fit just below that line. That is not cynicism. It is ordinary adaptation to the structure you built. It is how a schedule becomes a map. The Fifth Court anchoring our sources shows how precision policed itself. Witnesses swore to the summoning as uttered, again, in the same shape, then to the inquest being lawfully seated, then to the finding being brought in properly. That cascade did more than slow proceedings. It replaced personal trust with public repeatable proof. And the more proof you require, the more navigation skills you reward. So, what do we learn if we want to design against the edge without abandoning clarity altogether? First, align notice and proof standards to purpose, not only to form. The same shape rule preserved reliability, yet it also rewarded surface copying. A better chart would honor functional equivalence. Did the other side hear in time, understand the claim, and have a fair chance to answer? This helps explain why many modern systems validate timely notice even if a minor phrase misfires, provided the purpose of notice was met. Second, prune overlapping venues, or at least stage them with clean gates. Iceland's quarter courts and the Fifth Court created a wise escalator for deadlock, but they also multiplied thresholds to test. In Norway, differences between regional things, like the Gulathing and Frostathing traditions, gave travelers choices in where to anchor disputes. Overlap keeps access open. It also invites form selection as a tactic. A useful design principle is to ask, at each layer, what can this forum do that the prior cannot, and what must be settled below to keep this layer from being gamed? Third, smooth the cliffs in compensation. Schedules work like prices, and prices shape behavior. If a fine triples at a boundary, expect stories to bend around that boundary. Graduated scales, public reasoning for amounts, and periodic review keep price signals honest. The goal is not to eliminate strategy. The goal is to make strategy pull people toward the outcomes a system values, rather than nudge them toward theatrical compliance. Fourth, sunset the patches. The Fifth Court was a patch that saved a system under strain. It was good law, as the lawman Skapti affirmed when asked to rule on the knotty point Mord had raised. But every patch accretes barnacles. Sunset clauses force designers to return and audit how a fix is performing, with evidence rather than anecdotes. In other words, you clean the hull on schedule, not when the ship feels slow. Fifth, audit incentives at each amendment, especially around certification rituals. The habit of, I take witness, was a trust technology. It replaced memory with a public ledger spoken aloud. That worked because anyone could challenge a step that was missing. But the more steps you add, the more invalidation becomes a victory in itself. A good audit asks whether the fastest path to success is delivering the merit of the case or tripping the other side on form. These principles are not abstract. They map directly onto choices we recognize now. Tax codes that proliferate exceptions raise navigational literacy, then invite shelters that thread the edges those exceptions create. Arbitration clauses that multiply venues can resolve disputes quickly, but they also empower parties fluent in forum selection to steer outcomes. Corporate compliance programs that prove process by checklists deter misconduct until checklists become the game and the spirit of oversight dissolves into ritual. That is why the Viking world still pays dividends as a teaching case. It shows plainly how stable calendars, set phrases, and public seating can produce both justice and tactical play. The same structure that let feuds cool also taught people to look for timing gaps, venue choices, and wording anchors. Once people learn that game, they do not forget it. The only way forward is to write rules that make the productive path also the easy path. Let's make that concrete. Before adding a new remedy or forum, count how many doors you already have and mark who holds each key. If you must add a door, write the hinge. What proof must pass here that could not pass before? When drafting notice rules, define success by comprehension and opportunity to answer, and let minor defects cure when substance is satisfied. In compensation, use sliding scales and publish why numbers change. So the schedule teaches as well as prices. When you set deadlines, ask what behavior you are buying. The old Law Hill calendars bought regularity and predictability, which in turn bought participation. A calendar that is too tight buys invalidation. A calendar that is too loose buys stalling. Calibrate to the behavior you want, and make the cure for a mistick proportional to the harm that miscreated. That keeps timing a guardrail, not a steering wheel. Designing against the edge also means embracing daylight. The Icelanders struggled in public, with witnesses and neighbors inside a rope where everyone could see who sat and who spoke. Transparency was not decoration. It was a way to align reputation with procedure. Modern equivalents are open dockets, explainable algorithms, and published reasoning. If people can see the map, they can test it, and testing exposes perverse incentives before they calcify. The final insight circles back to where we began. Rules are not only threats, they are charts. They channel conduct by price, by place, and by time. The Vikings engineered a lawful world, precise enough that people could win by letter, and then they lived with the consequences. Once a culture learns to navigate, the cure is not to demand that nobody sails. The cure is better charts. Write procedures that measure what you actually value. Price harms on gradients, not cliffs, and keep the number of venues small and well gated. Sunset your fixes and audit the incentives they spawn. Give clear notice that rewards comprehension, not mimicry. If you design the structure so that the shortest path to victory is also the path that serves the system's purpose, you will still raise navigators. But the sea they cross will carry them, and everyone else where you meant to go. That is what the Law Hill still teaches.